A 12-year-old boy was playing Purple Haze in the rain on a London street corner in November 1967. Nobody stopped. Then Jimi Hendrix walked around the corner. The street was Barrack Street in Soho, and the time was a Thursday afternoon, just after 4 o'clock. When the light had already gone and the rain was coming down in the steady, persistent way of London autumn rain that has decided to stay. Barrack Street was a market street that shut down in the late afternoon, and by 4 o'clock, the vegetable stalls had packed up and the fishmongers had gone, and the street was the specific in-between kind of empty that market streets become after trading hours. Not deserted, but purposeless. The foot traffic reduced to people cutting through from one place to another rather than people with reasons to be there. The boy was standing against the wall of a fabric shop that had closed for the day. He had positioned himself under the narrow overhang of the shop front, which provided approximately 18 inches of shelter from the rain, not enough to keep him dry, but enough to keep the worst of it off the guitar. The guitar was a right-handed Fender Mustang in red that had been restrung for left-handed playing, the strings reversed, the nut notched on the wrong side in a modification that someone had done carefully and that suggested the guitar had been set up this way for some time. The guitar was too large for the boy. He was 12 years old and small for his age, and the Mustang's body came nearly to his hip. But he held it with the specific, confident grip of someone who had been holding this particular instrument long enough for its dimensions to feel normal, regardless of what it looked like from outside. He was playing Purple Haze. He had been playing it for 20 minutes, standing in the 18 inches of shelter in the rain on Barrack Street, and in 20 minutes, not one person had stopped. People had passed. A woman with shopping bags, 2 men in suits walking quickly with their heads down, a group of teenagers who glanced at him and kept moving, a delivery driver who paused for a moment on the opposite side of the street before getting back in his van. Nobody had stopped. Nobody had put anything in the case that was open on the wet pavement at his feet, the clasps bent from being opened and closed too many times. The boy's name was Daniel Achebe. Daniel was the son of a Nigerian father and a Jamaican mother, both of whom worked long hours and both of whom had strong opinions about the relative merits of guitar playing as an activity for a 12-year-old on a Thursday afternoon when there was homework to be done. Daniel had found the Mustang at a jumble sale in Brixton for 30 shillings, had carried it home on the bus, had learned to play it by listening to records and by working things out by ear in the specific, determined way of someone who has no other method available. Daniel had been playing for 8 months. 8 months was long enough to have made the chord shapes automatic and the right-hand rhythm consistent, but not long enough to have produced the tone or the phrasing that would have made a passing stranger stop. Nobody was stopping. Daniel played through the song again. The rain intensified for a moment and then settled back into its steady November pace. The guitar case had a small pool of water forming in the corner nearest the pavement. Daniel looked at it for a moment and then looked back at his left hand on the fretboard and kept playing. Jimi Hendrix came around the corner from Broadwick Street at 4:23. Jimi Hendrix had been in a music shop on Denmark Street that afternoon, looking at instruments, and was cutting through Soho on his way back to the hotel in Mayfair. He was wearing a dark coat over the embroidered jacket, the collar turned up against the rain, his wide-brimmed hat shedding water at the brim. He was walking at the pace of someone who is not in a hurry, but is also not inclined to linger in the rain. He heard the guitar before he turned the corner. He heard it the way Jimi Hendrix heard music in public spaces, not as background, not as something to be assessed and filed while the primary business of moving through the world continued, but as a thing that required immediate and primary attention, the way a sound in a dark room requires immediate attention when you are not sure what it is. He had heard his own song played many times in many contexts. He had not heard it played like this. What he heard from around the corner was Purple Haze played by someone who had learned it entirely by ear and who had been playing for 8 months and who was 12 years old and who was standing in the rain on a street where nobody was stopping. What he heard was the architecture of the song, stripped to its essential structure, without the technique that adds confidence to the framework, played with the specific quality of someone who knows what the song is supposed to feel like and is reaching toward that feeling with whatever means are currently available. Jimi Hendrix turned the corner. He saw Daniel Achebe against the wall of the fabric shop, the Mustang across his chest, the case on the wet pavement, the rain. He saw the restrung guitar, the reversed strings, the notched nut, and he registered what it meant about the player. He stood at the corner for a moment and listened. He did not immediately approach. He listened the way he had listened to Thomas Whitfield on Wardour Street, with the full interior attention of someone receiving information rather than making an assessment. Daniel had not seen Jimi Hendrix come around the corner. Daniel was looking at his left hand. Jimi Hendrix walked to where Daniel was standing. He said, "You restrung it yourself?" Daniel looked up. He saw the dark coat, the collar, the wide-brimmed hat shedding water. He did not immediately recognize the face. It was dark and raining, and Daniel had been looking at his fretboard for 20 minutes, and his eyes needed a moment to adjust to looking at something further away. Daniel said, "My dad did it." He said, "I'm left-handed." Jimi Hendrix said, "I know." He looked at the guitar. He said, "How long have you been playing?" Daniel said, 8 months. Jimi Hendrix crouched down, not to the pavement but to a level closer to Daniel's height, the specific movement of an adult who is trying to remove the height differential from a conversation with a child. He looked at Daniel's left hand on the fretboard. He looked at the position of Daniel's thumb. He said, "Can I show you something?" Daniel Achebe was 12 years old, and a stranger in a dark coat in the rain had just asked to touch his guitar. The correct response, by every instruction Daniel's parents had given him about strangers, was no. Daniel Achebe looked at the man crouching in front of him and said, "Okay." Jimi Hendrix repositioned Daniel's thumb on the back of the neck, not taking the guitar, not removing it from Daniel's hands, but moving Daniel's left thumb from its current position to a position slightly lower on the neck and slightly further toward the headstock. A small adjustment, the kind of adjustment that a teacher makes in the first month of instruction, the adjustment that changes the angle of the fingers relative to the frets and makes chord shapes that were effortful become automatic. He said, "Try the first chord now." Daniel played the first chord. The difference was immediate and audible. The chord rang cleanly where before it had buzzed on the D string. Daniel played it again. Clean again. Daniel said, "How did you do that?" Jimi Hendrix said, "It's where your thumb goes." He said, "If your thumb is here," he moved Daniel's thumb back to its original position, "the angle is wrong and you have to push harder to get a clean sound." He moved the thumb back to the new position. "But if it's here, the angle works and the sound comes free." He said, "Try the whole song from the start." Daniel played Purple Haze from the beginning. With the thumb in the correct position, the chord shapes were easier to reach and the transitions between them were smoother, and what came out of the guitar on the wet Berwick Street pavement was audibly closer to what the song was than what Daniel had been playing for the previous 20 minutes. A woman with an umbrella who had been walking past slowed down. She stood at a short distance and listened for a moment and then moved on, but she had slowed. A man coming out of the pub on the corner stood in the doorway and listened. Neither of them had stopped for what Daniel had been playing before the thumb adjustment. Jimi Hendrix watched Daniel play through the song. He did not speak during the playing. When Daniel finished, he said, "You've been learning by ear." Daniel said, "I don't know anyone who can teach me." Jimi Hendrix said, "You're teaching yourself. That's different from not being taught." He said, "The ear knows what it's supposed to sound like. The hand takes longer to catch up. You just need to help the hand catch up faster." He said, "The thumb is one thing. Can I show you one more?" He showed Daniel the right hand muting technique, the way the heel of the right hand rests lightly against the strings near the bridge to control the sustain and prevent unwanted resonance. Another small thing, the kind of thing that takes a beginning player months to discover by accident and that a more experienced player can demonstrate in 30 seconds. Daniel practiced it for several minutes. The sound changed again, tighter, more controlled, closer to the record. By this time, there were 6 people standing in the rain watching. Not a crowd, not a performance. 6 people who had been walking past and had heard something that gave them a reason to slow down and then a reason to stop. The guitar case on the wet pavement now had several coins in it that had not been there before. Jimi Hendrix stood up from his crouch. He looked at Daniel Achebe standing against the wall of the fabric shop in the rain with the Mustang across his chest. He reached into the inside pocket of the dark coat and produced a business card, not his own card, but a card for a music school on Charlotte Street that he had picked up at the Denmark Street shop that afternoon, the card of a place that taught guitar to young people in the evenings and on weekends. He said, "Go here on Saturday morning." He said, "Tell them you've been learning by ear for 8 months. They'll know what to do with you." Daniel took the card. He looked at it. He said, "I don't have money for lessons." Jimi Hendrix said, "Ask for a man named Graham Peters." He said, "Tell him I sent you." He said it in the tone of someone who has already made an arrangement that Daniel does not yet know has been made. He said, "It will be covered." Daniel looked at the card and then at the man in the dark coat. The 6 people standing in the rain were watching this exchange with the expression of people who are witnessing something they don't have full context for but can feel is significant. Daniel said, "Who are you?" Jimi Hendrix told him his name. Daniel Achebe was 12 years old and had been playing guitar for 8 months and had learned Purple Haze by listening to the record so many times that he could hear it in his sleep. He knew the name. He knew it. Though every 12-year-old in London in November 1967 knew the name, which was immediately and completely and with the specific full-body response of encountering something that has existed as a large idea and has suddenly become a specific person standing in the rain on Barrack Street. Daniel said nothing. He looked at the man who had adjusted his thumb and shown him the muting technique and given him the card for the music school, and he was quiet in the specific way of someone receiving information that is too large to immediately speak about. Jimi Hendrix said, "Keep playing." He said it simply, as the most direct and complete piece of advice available. Keep playing. Then he turned up his collar against the rain and walked back around the corner toward Broadwick Street and Mayfair. Daniel Achebe stood against the wall of the fabric shop in the rain with the Mustang across his chest and the music school card in his hand and played Purple Haze again. The 6 people who had stopped were still there. One more person stopped. The guitar case on the pavement caught the rain and the coins that people dropped as they passed, and Daniel played with his thumb in the correct position and his right hand muting the strings at the bridge. And the song sounded different than it had for the previous 20 minutes, and the difference was audible to anyone who walked past, and some of them stopped. Daniel went to Charlotte Street on Saturday morning. He asked for Graham Peters. Graham Peters had been expecting him. Daniel Achebe studied guitar at the Charlotte Street School for 4 years. He went on to play in bands and then to teach, and the students he taught heard from him the same 2 adjustments that had been shown to him on a wet Barrack Street in November 1967, the thumb position and the right-hand muting, passed forward in the specific way that practical knowledge passes forward. From hand to hand, one player to the next, carried not in any document but in the muscle memory of everyone who has ever been shown the right way to hold a guitar by someone who knew. The 6 people who had stopped on Barrack Street that Thursday afternoon and who had watched the exchange described it afterward in terms that converged on the same quality, the ordinariness of it, not the significance. Everyone who was there understood the significance once the name was said and the card was given, and Jimi Hendrix walked back around the corner. But the ordinariness before the significance, the 20 minutes of a man crouching in the rain next to a 12-year-old, and adjusting his thumb and showing him how to mute the strings, the specific domestic quality of a music lesson given on a wet market street in Soho on a Thursday afternoon when the stalls had closed and the light was gone. Margaret, who had been walking home from a dressmaker's shop on Carnaby Street, said she stopped because she heard the guitar change. Same song, same boy, same guitar, but the sound changed after the man crouched next to him, and she stopped to understand why. She said, "What I remember most clearly is the card." The man gave the boy a card and said, "Tell them I sent you." Not as a favor, not as something impressive, as a simple piece of information the boy needed. He made the whole of it feel normal. That was the thing. Arthur, a music journalist who had interviewed Jimi Hendrix 6 months earlier, came out of the pub on the corner and recognized him immediately. His instinct was to approach. He did not. He said, "I stood in the doorway for the full 20 minutes because what was happening on that pavement did not require a music journalist. What was happening was a musician teaching a child." He said, "Most famous musicians perform the encounter with a young fan, perform generosity, perform interest." Jimi Hendrix did not perform anything. He crouched in the rain and moved the boy's thumb and showed him how to mute the strings. He said, I didn't write about it because I couldn't find the right description. I've been trying since.